Thank you so much, Yoko, and thank you, friends of the Santa Fe Wagner Society. I see some people are connecting from San Diego and El Dorado. I guess that's in California. Anyway, I'm speaking to you from Cooperstown, New York, where it has been very cold and been a lot of winter, but I do see a few buds coming out, which I'm excited about. And I did work at the Santa Fe Opera through much of the 90s and have a great affection for that area and for the company. And I was very fond of John Crosby, who was the general director at that time. Anyway, now we're here to talk a little bit about Wagner and directing Wagner. Well, at this point, I have directed a fair amount of Wagner and been around a lot of it and worked on several ring cycles and directed the ring cycle myself several times at the San Francisco Opera and at the Washington National Opera, where I serve as the artistic director. I hope that some of you Wagnerians saw last month, the San Francisco Opera did a Wagner festival and showed the entire cycle with a lot of great programming and lectures and discussions from a lot of different people. So I think that that was hopefully gave some of us a little bit of a Wagner feel. I want to just let people know before we talk about directing Wagner that I'm also the general director of the Glimmerglass Festival. And this summer we will be doing some Wagner we're doing a whole outdoor season. And one of the programs we're doing is called Gods and Mortals. And it features Eric Owens. And we will be doing a lot of selections from the Ring, Tannhäuser, Meistersinger, and Lohengrin, with a number of different soloists. Directing Wagner is definitely different than directing almost anything else. I didn't direct my first Wagner until 1992, which was at the Royal Danish Opera, and it was Tannhäuser in what was a marvelous cast that included at that point the young Steve Fogh Anderson, who went on to sing Siegmund at Bayreuth, and his wife Tina Kieberg was the Elizabeth, and she went on to sing a lot of Wagnerian roles. Since then, I've done I don't know, Lohengrin, Meistersinger, Tristan, Dutchman, and the Ring, as I said several times. Before I first directed the Tannhäuser at the Danish Opera, I was very fortunate to be an assistant director at the San Francisco Opera in the mid-'80s. And I worked, at that point, there was a cycle directed by Nicholas Lanehoff and conducted by Edo de Waard, no stranger to Santa Fe audiences. And I ended up writing all of the super titles for that Ring cycle. That happened because I went to the then general director, Terry McEwen, and I said, we had just started using them and we used them for student performances of Traviata. And I went to him and I said, you know, I really think if we're doing the Ring, and I was like pretty brash at that age to say this to him. I really think if we're doing the Ring, a lot of people don't know what is going on. And I would like to volunteer to write super titles for the entire Ring cycle. And at the time, the marketing department said, we think that that really won't sell very well, but we'll sell them for one cycle. There were 3 cycles. This was, I think, the summer of '85. And it turned out that the cycle with the super titles sold out immediately. And then they realized, okay, we should start using them. So I ended up, what was such a great experience at a pretty young age, I ended up sitting through all of the rehearsals of the Ring and writing these text for the super titles for the translations. And this was a way that I was already I wouldn't say enamored with Wagner. I liked Wagner, but it really catapulted me into an incredible experience of sitting through several weeks of solid Ring rehearsals and just trying to understand really the text, which is so important, as you all know, that the text of Wagner, the words, is so inextricably linked, you know, with the music, you know, as he says, the Gesamtkunstwerk. And so for me, that was an introduction like nothing else. I could never have, that never could have happened. I don't even, it was amazing that it did. And it gave me such a firm grounding in his works. I then was invited for the first time to direct Tannhäuser in '92. And for me, it was truly a revelation because the process of directing is very different with Wagner. You know, you always begin rehearsals by talking about the characters with the performers, talking about the music with the conductor, trying to understand together what a piece is about. You know, what is really the meaning of it. And any of Wagner's works require a lot more what we call table work, just sitting at the table, talking about it and figuring out what does everything mean. Of course, before that, as a director, as I know you all know, you have spent a long time creating the physical world, the scenery, the costumes, all of that. And so for me, it was, you know, it was amazing to go into Tannhäuser, a work, of course, about an artist. And, you know, how great to have that really be the first piece that I could sink my teeth into. Once you get through that, what I call the table work period, you begin to rehearse. And normally what's so funny, you know, in a Verdi opera, okay, let's say you're doing La Traviata. Let's say you rehearse Act 1, you know, takes a couple of days to put it together. And then you say, okay, we'll do a run through of Act 1. Well, a run through of Act 1 might only be 35 or 40 minutes. However, when you're running through an act of a Wagner opera, it's going to take up, you know, usually an hour and a half. So suddenly the whole rehearsal process shifts from doing, you know, scenes and working on it to a much broader thing. You end up, it takes an incredible amount of time to rehearse a 5.5 hour opera, and in a very different way, because, you know, Wagner pieces have such a long line, such a long story to tell. And also you're generally not working with a lot of people. Most of Wagner's operas just have a few people in a scene. And for me, that was this just amazing, like a rather obvious but simple realization that it wasn't that you could actually rehearse an act over a couple of days. You might need a whole week to rehearse an act of an opera like Tannhäuser. And you know, what was great about doing that there was that the Danes have a real affinity for Wagner. There have been many great Scandinavian singers, as you know, who've sung all the Wagner repertory. And of course, most of them speak German. And I do think, someone has asked if I am multilingual, which I am. I think it is pretty imperative to be able to speak German to direct these works. Not that even speaking German allows you to understand everything that Wagner is saying, but at least you have a grasp, and then you spend a lot of time with a dictionary and often with scholarly texts, just trying to understand exactly what was Wagner's intention, so that you as a director can work with that intention, you know, how the leitmotifs direct you, how the text directs you. And so that for me was really an amazing learning lesson and realization that I had on my first go, which was Tannhäuser. By the time I got to my second Wagner piece, which was Meistersinger, no short opera as well, I realized, you know, I sort of understood like how to rehearse a Wagner opera versus Verdi, Puccini, Rossini, any of that, and that it just requires an enormous amount of time and talking with everyone. But it also requires a different sense of time. You know, often with a cast, you might say, let's run through something this a couple of times. When you do a Wagner opera, you're gonna like run through something once, you know, like in a day, not, you know, a couple times in a day. And I think it's important that you, you know, that you give the singers that time to really reflect, as well as, of course, the time to work with the conductor. The conductor is so important in every opera, but even more so in Wagner, because a conductor can support your ideas, or maybe they disagree with you. And when they support you, of course, you're really able to fuse together exactly what Wagner wanted in terms of words and text. Meistersinger is an opera that requires an enormous amount of work in the last act, because, of course, for the Festvisa, for the festivals at the end of the piece, that takes so much rehearsal because you have so many different chorus groups of Meisters. So it's sort of amazing. You do the first part of Act 3, which is just Sachs and Eva in a very long scene, which requires an enormous amount of dialogue and connection between the two of them, to going to huge spectacle, which Meistersinger at the end has to deliver a lot of spectacle. I see a couple questions popping up, and I will answer them as we go along. As an opera company director deciding what sort of stage productions to present in a season, how do you decide between the sort of productions with general public appeal that you obviously need to do sometimes and productions that just let the music speak for itself? Well, I mean, as a general director of an opera company, I try to always make a kind of what I call a dim sum platter in a season. You want to have different kinds of productions, different kinds of operas, different kinds of singers, so that there is something that is going to speak to someone and then hopefully entice them in so that they're going to come see everything. That is very, very important. And of course, you know, does letting the music speak for itself? I don't think you just want the music to speak for itself. I think you want the music and the dramatic action to be fused together. That is my hope always as a producer. And then remember, I'm asked here, remembering that you must engage some singers several years in advance, how often has it happened that singers show up and you realize that the voice is no longer suited for a role? Well, that is a terrible moment in rehearsals, I'll tell you that. And yes, that does happen, where you realize you've hired somebody and it's a total disaster. And then you, the person responsible for that mistake, have to generally pay the artist out and find a replacement very quickly, which is very, very difficult. What's interesting is in Wagner, that seems to happen a lot less than when you are doing Trovatore, for example. You know, Wagnerian singers, people who sing a lot of the Wagner rep, they're a kind of band of people. They tend to often sing frequently together in different productions, which of course I think enhances their performances. And they also are people who generally, you know, bring to the table an incredible intelligence about the music and the text. Not to say that people who are singing Italian repertory don't, but again, it's a very different process. So I think I'll talk a little bit about the ring cycle. I first started directing the ring cycle at the Washington National Opera in 2008. And generally most ring cycles, you know, it's not like Bayreuth, except for Bayreuth, most places you try to do one at a time or two at a time. And in this case, when I began at the Washington National Opera, we did Valkyrie first, which is of course a great way into a production, but it's hard for the director because it's not the first piece in the story, right? So you have to figure out your entire approach before you actually just do one of them. And so in this case, we did Valkyrie, then Rheingold, then we did Valkyrie again, then Siegfried, and we didn't do Götterdämmerung until we did the entire cycle at the San Francisco Opera in 2011, where we did several cycles with Nina Stemmer, who created an amazing sensation with her first Brunhilde. And then we did it at the Washington National Opera in 2015, and then again at the San Francisco Opera in 2018, each time with different Brunhildes and Siegfrieds and different Wotans, which makes rehearsing the ring so, so exciting, because every time you do it with new singers, you discover new things. New things, they bring you a certain kind of energy, and your approach to it also speaks to it. For myself, the ring that I produced with designers Michael Jurgen, Kathy Zuber, and projection designer Katie Tucker, I'm getting a question here about the setting, which I'm going to talk about. With the basis of the ring so mythical, why did you set the 2018 San Francisco ring in a 200s very urban New York City setting? Well, that was actually only for the Valkyrie, and it wasn't New York, by the way. But our approach to the ring was really to give it a look at America. We used American iconography and images from the mid-19th century to a slightly futuristic, let's say 2040 approach. We began with Rheingold set during the time of the gold rush, and that Albrecht was like a miner. And then when we went to Valhalla, it was really the beginning of the American industrial period, the great industrialists who built this country, the Rockefellers, who built the industries here. And that Albrecht and Nibelheim was very much the slaves that things were built on the backs of. And that by the time we got to Valkyrie, we were moving forward. There was a sense kind of Citizen Kane aspect about Wotan, and that Sigmund and Sieglinde lived in a kind of Appalachian world. The Valkyries very much suggested a kind of World War II women. They were parachuting out of planes. And then by the time we get to Siegfried, we start to get to really the destruction of the environment, which was so important to Wagner and important to our approach, where we feel that a lot of Siegfried happens kind of in a wasteland. And then Götterdämmerung had a very futuristic feeling where all nature had been dead. And the only thing that, of course, can save it at the end is Brunhilde, who is ultimately the great hero of the ring cycle. So I felt that we connected with myth and that we suggested very abstract environments, which I did think suggested myth, although I see Glenn Smerig maybe didn't think so. But that was really our overall approach to it. And again, something like the ring cycle, it takes a vast amount of time to conceive and to rehearse. And for myself, there were several key important things. It was really this journey through a kind of American setting. It was also very much about the destruction of the environment. By the time we get to the end of the Götterdämmerung, all nature had been destroyed, which of course we're witnessing around us every day. And then in some ways, a feminist approach where definitely Brunhilde is the hero that Wotan can never see. So for me, it was really that the women took the lead in the piece, because most of the women are pretty good characters, Fricka, except, okay, Gutruna, not ideal, but she's kind of duped and forced around by her brother. But most of the female characters are very good in the ring. And they try to lead a solid, principled path, whereas the men don't always make the right decisions in the piece. As we know, the ring is very much about a lot of broken contracts. So that was a bit about our approach to the ring and how we treated it. And again, what's so great about the ring is to go back to it each time with new performers, and to again dig into it. The last time I did it was with the Brunhilde of Irene Thieren, Greer Grimsley, and Daniel Brenna as Siegfried. As I said, I've done it now with a number of different Brunhildes and Wotans, and each one of them brings you something so special. And that's the thing that I find that you really have to respect so much in the works of Wagner, is what the singers can bring to it, not just, vocally, but also they often have a rich experience of having performed these roles and performed other roles in the Wagner repertory that may link together with it. I'm just talking away here, and I'm happy to answer any other questions if people would like. Otherwise, I will keep going. So I see that Santa Fe was to have done Tristan and Isolde, and I believe that I presume they will get back to it at some point. I know there was a wonderful cast, and I think having that cast and hearing that outside would have been a truly magical thing. And I'm sure that that will eventually happen. For me, my first Tristan was with Ben Heppner and Jane Eaglin at the Seattle Opera. And Tristan is so different than the rest of Wagner's works because it it is truly so much a meditation. You are really following the story, through the interior world of each character, and so discovering that and penetrating that is a very it's very difficult. And I was blessed to have great singers, but who they all were debuting in the roles. So I remember spending several weeks just talking about the text and talking about the meaning of that piece. Again, something that, the so amazing thing about Wagner is that how you interpret it and how you approach it changes, I think, with every production. And also, even every time you go back to visit a work, you are changed. I mean, like, I may have felt more like Brangena then, now I feel more like King Mark as you age in life. Jack, thank you very much. Your Seattle Tristan was my first. Loved that production and the cast. It was a magnificent cast. And what was great was everyone was debuting, which is again, for a director, it's more work, but it's very gratifying because you are trying to figure it out together. And in that case, with each of those artists, we really spent an enormous amount of time. And the one thing I will say that's so great is usually when you direct a Wagner opera, everyone is there for the whole rehearsal process. Often when you're directing, Fanciulla del West, you've got to deal with people coming late or whatever. So let's see. Kathy Charla is asking, do you have a favorite Wagner opera to direct? And if you do, what is it about the opera that you love most? Well, I mean, look, for a director, the prize, the golden ring is the Ring. And for me, that was truly my favorite. And Götterdämmerung is my favorite opera in the Ring cycle. And because it is truly about Brunhilde and a woman who I think saves the world and allows for regeneration and rebirth. And she has such inspirational music and, says such amazing things in it. So I would be happy if I had to direct Götterdämmerung frequently, a lot happier than directing The Elixir of Love. Not to say I don't like The Elixir of Love, but sometimes directing those operas, you get a little bit like, oh, what are we going to do with this scene? But that's to say, something like The Flying Dutchman, that opera, I have directed that numerous times because, again, that's an opera where people, where companies, it's the easiest Wagner opera to produce. You do not need huge voices. Wagner wrote it as a young man. It's still more in the romantic era, romantic genre. And smaller companies can produce it. And so that's why I find that it tends to be done the most. And I've done it, I think I've done 5 different productions of it over my career. And what's so interesting is, in the pandemic 2020 last year, at Glimmerglass, we were going to do Die Feen, which is Wagner's first opera. And I'm sure it means the fairies. And I doubt many people out there listening today have seen it. But what was interesting, which Rob Lucas is asking, can you talk more about the linkage between characters in the Ring with characters from other operas? What was really interesting in Die Feen is that there's a love story, and it is between the male who is a noble mortal, and his love interest. His name is Arundel, and his love interest is Ada, and she is a doe, a deer, like doe, a deer. She is a deer, and he falls in love with her when he is hunting. And the deal is basically he forsakes his mortality to have his relationship with her. So, of course, what's so interesting is, in that first opera, he wrote it when he was 20. He's already dealing with issues of mortality and the gods. What is the difference? And I always feel that in Wagner's operas, you know, the gods are more mortal than the mortals often, particularly in the ring. You know, the foibles of Wotan and his, you know, shady deals with Loga feel so human and so like bad lawyer, you know, more than anything. So I think, you know, what's interesting is, for me, was great was getting to know that first opera, and also the fact that the music that he wrote for the soprano prefigures so much of the you know, hefty sound that you need in some, you know, particularly in like Kundry. You know, Kundry often a mezzo or a soprano. And so what was interesting for me was to really study that score. The same way with, you know, I studied the score, and I almost did a production of Rienzi, his second opera. Again, an opera which I love, and of course we all know the overture. But again, you know, Wagner's fascination with mythology, Romans history, you know, the god, in a sense, you know, making a god out of a mortal. I think what's so interesting is we see that, you know, coming back over and over. The other theme that I think about a lot in Wagner is how much he loves artists. You know, obviously Meistersinger and Tannhäuser are about artists and about making art. Isn't that interesting? I think it's fascinating. And the fact that, you know, the whole story of Tannhäuser, you know, is about a singer. I mean, he's a poet and a singer. And the same thing, of course, with Meistersinger. The fact that these operas are devoted to the celebration of the artist, but also have great dramatic arcs, I think is one of the just magical things about Wagner, and that he tried to really celebrate the artist. And of course, I think the characters in, you know, in both of those pieces are so well drawn. I mean, Hans Sachs, you know, being perhaps the most human, and, you know, I mean, everybody says this joke, you know, he's the shoemaker, he's fixing your soles of your shoes, and this, and, you know, of course, all of the townspeople's souls. And I think it's, you know, when you see a great Sachs, you know, I mean, James Morris was a wonderful Sachs. When you see that, you realize the depth of humanity of Wagner. And I think, you know, now, you know, as we're constantly re-examining Wagner in terms of, you know, contemporary principles and ideas, you know, I'm not going to get into that actually in this, because everybody's so opinionated about it, and let's let it go. Let's focus on his works. But again, so for me, I think what was so interesting about Meistersinger and Tannhäuser is the front and center of an artist. And what's so great about Meistersinger is they're amateur artists. What a wonderful thing to celebrate. Really, what a wonderful thing to celebrate. So ironically, this morning, I was doing a talk on Billy Budd for another opera company, an opera I've directed a number of times. And it got me thinking about Parsifal today. Parsifal is an opera that I truly love, and someone's asking, is there one I haven't directed I'd like to direct? It would definitely be Parsifal. I was supposed to direct it. I started directing it. We were doing it in Chile, in Santiago, and a revolution happened, or, you know, wasn't an uprising happened. And so the production was canceled. And I was so sorry, because I had worked so hard to prepare it. But the reason I mention it, and the connection to Budd, is just, you know, the sense of purity and goodness. Something, of course, always that Wagner was seeking in certain characters, you know, that the gut-wrenching side of what is good and what is not good, what is evil, and, you know, and what does evil mean, you know, when we see certain characters, you know, is Dutchman evil? No, he's death, and dealing with mortality. But in any case, so for me, Parsifal is an opera that I've never directed, that I hope to direct someday, because really the journey of Parsifal is so beautiful and so meaningful. And just so special. I might say a few words about the choruses in Wagner, because he, you know, with the exception of the Ring, the chorus is only in Götterdämmerung, and what's always sort of interesting is the women in Götterdämmerung, the chorus women, they only sing 21 measures. It's very short, but they're in the whole scene in the Gebetschunghalle. But most choruses in Wagner are really marvelous to direct, because they are rich and full music, whether it's, you know, Lohengrin, Parzival, Meistersinger, any of these pieces. The chorus brings something to the dramatic story. They're not just like support. They're often telling the story, reacting. And that was something, as I studied that first opera, Die Feen, that I mentioned, he wrote so much for chorus. And, you know, many composers, writing for chorus is an art form unto itself, you know, not just musically, but also dramatically. How do you weave the chorus into the dramatic arc of a story? And that was something that he was grappling with already in this first piece, Die Feen. And clearly we see in all of his works, the chorus is front and center. It's so much a part of his music and so much a part of his use of storytelling. And I think sometimes, you know, the textures that the chorus bring are, you know, and often he writes in unison. That's the other interesting thing for choruses. You know, most composers don't do that. You know, he writes so much of the vocal music, you know, same words, same note values, you know, different chord structures. And so for me, I always think, you know, you got to really listen, who's he putting in prominence? And the other thing is that, you know, Wagner tends, you know, he tends often to give, I think, you know, the greatest choral music to the men, you know, although having said that, I was just thinking of the Pilgrim's Chorus and Tannhäuser, but for a moment, I was just thinking back to Parzival, you know, the men are, you know, the entire first act is the men's chorus. And so that's why when you hear a great chorus doing these works, at the, you know, the sonorous level is part of what transports you. And I think, you know, you wouldn't be here if you weren't in love with Wagner's music and its, you know, qualities that transport you outside of the world often. So we've talked about a bit about his operas, choruses, music. I'm happy to talk a bit about the singers, and just, you know, now I think what's so interesting is we've really developed, you know, an incredible generation of American Wagnerians. Over the last couple of decades, there have been many great American singers who have sung Wagner. I think part of that, you know, of course, many Americans go to Germany to develop their careers, but also I think that Wagner has come more into our repertory in American theaters. We accept it more. It's often part of our programming where it might not have been at one point. Okay, so Yoko was asking a question about Meistersinger. Everybody says it's too long for Santa Fe. Well, what if we split it in two? First two acts at night, the next day, before the sun gets too hot, do the third act the next day, ending with the artists and audience members marching out to the parking lot for a giant picnic and cross your fingers that it doesn't rain. Staatsoper in Berlin did this split Meistersinger. I think we can do it if we can manage it financially. What do I think? Well, I don't think that I should comment because I run another opera company, and I think, however, the Santa Fe Opera and its leadership want to run things and make their decisions, I leave that to them. I would never presume to suggest how another company should do something. I will say Berlin did this, and I think it was a fabulous thing, but we do have to remember that the amazing amount of subsidy that comes from the German government to German theaters. Just remember that. And not just Germany, many European theaters. The other day, I was speaking to the Czech ambassador to the United States, and he reminded me that in Prague alone, there are 10 places that play and make classical music. Prague has as many people as like Rhode Island. So, you know, the same thing with the Staatsoper in Berlin. Remember, there are 3 opera companies in the city of Berlin, and Berlin is not a big city. And so, of course, they could afford to do something like that. I mean, part of it is about cost. Personally, would I like that? I'd love it. I mean, that's one of the funnest things about any of these huge Wagner pieces is when you get, a break in the middle of it and you can really talk about it. And the audience, I always think it is very difficult. And that's one of the great things about seeing an opera in a festival setting is that's what you're doing. It's not like you went to work all day and then you're going to sit through the opera until midnight. When you're in a festival, your day may be different. A performance takes on a different quality. And that's, I loved my time in Santa Fe. I loved working in the opera there. And I love running a festival at Glimmerglass now because there's a very different attitude than when you're in an urban center. And that people came from like working on the stock market or being in a bank all day. They just, they had to fight for, a parking place or whatever. So Jack asked, do you have a musical background to teach you to read scores? Yes, I was very lucky. Growing up, my grandmother was a classical pianist and we had a piano in our home. She taught me how to play the piano. I also learned how to play the flute, the clarinet, and because I'm tall, I played the bass clarinet in band. I still play the piano very infrequently, but of course, can read music. I often work with conductors with a full orchestra score, particularly for something like Wagner, because you need to know what the orchestra is doing. The orchestra is a huge character in Wagner. They're always saying something and doing something that should be cluing you in. I'm also very fortunate that my mother was an actress, and obviously, therefore, I was around theaters a lot growing up. So I had a great mix of classical music and theater. She sang in many musicals, and so I had this connection with American musicals. But Wagner, I really started to fall in love with actually when I was in college. It was when I first really heard it. By sitting in the music listening room of the library where I used to sit to study, and the librarian in there played Parsifal, and I heard the end of Parsifal, and I was like, what is that? That is amazing. I want to know more about that. And in a way, that for me was sort of the first door opening to the music of Wagner. And I'm sure everybody has had an experience like that. I don't think you come to Wagner particularly young, although I will say that, I've seen, many kids come up to me and tell me they love, not many kids, some kids come up and say they love Wagner. A little bit about kids for a second. When I first directed Rheingold, I decided that all the Nibelungen would be children. And the first time I directed Rheingold was like now 15 years ago. And these were small kids, and they were working in the mine of Albrecht. And I'll never forget, there was a young boy, his name was Chancellor, and he is Black. And somehow he ended up being in this, and he was a wonderful super and a wonderful extra. And he fell in love with Wagner. And this little boy sat through every rehearsal. I'm in touch with his mother over the years later. She's explained to me, could I write him a college recommendation years later? Because I had seen him off and on. Anyway, this boy who fell in love with Wagner and fell in love with music ended up going to Columbia on a full scholarship. And I think by now he's graduated. But anyway, it's so wonderful that, some kids have completely embraced it. So when you direct Parsifal, what would you do about the dove descending at the end? In general, I think Wagner wrote lots of staging notes, correct? How do you work with Wagner's staging notes if you don't feel they're right in today's world, or do you not have any issues? That's a very good question. When you direct Parsifal, what would you do about the dove descending at the end? Actually, that's not that difficult. That, if you want to do it, and you want to have a dove and a real dove, birds are always possible in the theater. Is it going to be a projection? Is it going to be a symbolic dove? Is a dancer going to carry the dove? As a director, you with the designers, figure out, how you're going to do that. It's not just the dove, but it's like, what did everything look like before? Should the dove just be, a simple white ribbon that runs across the stage? I don't know. Again, it depends on how you explore the piece. Wagner wrote extremely complex stage directions in all of his scores, all of his scores. So like if you read the librettos, usually they're very involved stage directions. Do we learn from them? Yes. Do we do everything he says? No. I mean, one of the great revolutions of the 20th century was Wieland Wagner, the composer's grandson, who directed the Ring Cycle many times and gave us that incredible aesthetic with Joseph Svoboda, the designer of the bare stage, to suggest, Brunhilde's Rock. And so in a way that revolutionized totally the scenic approach to Wagner and his extremely involved stage directions. If you ever visited Bayreuth, you can see the museum. You can see the museum there. You can go in the museum and see all of the original designs of his first productions, which is fascinating. But now I think that, again, Wagner's work is perhaps some of the most thoughtful and something that people constantly reinterpret. And that's what I think makes his works always feel contemporary. It's a masterpiece, but it's also a masterpiece of content and ideas that becomes, in a way, the clay. So it's great to read those stage directions, but again, I think everyone interprets them in a different way. Jack is asking about the bass clarinet has all the most important solos in Wagner. Bass clarinet portends many of the major actions. You are absolutely right. But so does the horn, so every instrument has its moments. And, that's one of the great things, like when you do Rheingold, and you're backstage and the anvils are all lined up, it's a pretty amazing thing. So yes, the bass clarinet is important, but so is everybody. I mean, that's the thing is, the orchestra is such a huge character in Wagner's operas, and to really study the scores and to, study the leitmotifs, it's fun. It's great. I mean, I can't say, it's not like playing Scrabble, but it's a great and exciting thing to do. I'm seeing some of my scores, or I'm in my home office, like everybody else living out of my home office now in upstate New York. And I have some of my scores here, and I see very weather-beaten copies of a couple of Wagner operas up there, because again, as a director, the score is the Bible. You always go back to the score. The score is like the roadmap. And you need to always read it and study it, and because it's always going to give you something. Of course, you always use, as a director, you always use source material. What inspired the composer? What's going on in the world of art and literature and politics at the time of composition? And today, how do things reflect what's going on today? Those are the canon of, in a way, of how a director approaches a work, is always through. I think you start with the score, you start with the music, you start with the words, you study that, and then you study everything that went on around it. And of course, as we know, so much happened to Wagner personally, so much happened in the periods and times that he was writing. Imagine what he would have written if he had come to Santa Fe and seen some of those incredible surroundings. That would have totally inspired him, I'm sure. And the mythic sense of the land there, it's so powerful. It just overwhelms you. So, my friends in Santa Fe, I wish I could come out there and visit you at some point, but I'm going to be here in Glimmerglass all summer. If you are traveling east, I hope that you will come see us. We are doing okay, someone's asking about the collaborative process, and then I'll probably sign off because I see our hour is almost up. Would you explain how the collaborative process actually works between general director, conductor, stage director, and designers? Hello, Leanne Mahoney. It's great to see you on this. So generally the process goes like this. A general director hires the director. Often they've hired the conductor already, or the conductor is hired at the same time. The general director, the conductor, and the stage director often meet together to figure out a cast. And the director is responsible for hiring all the designers. And this is usually a couple years out, the same way it's a couple years out till you hire the singers that you want. And you, the director, choose those people. That's really your first big decision. And you work on creating a kind of, what is the interpretation? What are we going to do? How are we going to approach the piece? Not like she's wearing a blue costume, but much more, what is the world? How can we suggest this? How can we support the story? And that's where you're using all of your research and all of your findings and going to museums. And, this is before the internet, and now with the internet, of course, you're all over it, learning it. And the process, generally, you create a model with the set designer, a model like, white card, something that shows you what the spaces are going to look like. And then you work with the company. Usually there's a technical director, and they help you figure out what's possible, what's not possible. And if you've ever built anything, what's too expensive. And the same thing with costumes. You figure, what is the character? What does the character need? Who should the character be? What should the character look like? So all of that involves an enormous amount of research as well as interpretation. Okay, I was trying to sign off. Do you work from a piano, vocal score, or full orchestra? Do you make notes in the score for later reference? I study, when I study something, I study with a full orchestra score. When I go to rehearsal, it's with a piano vocal score. Nowadays, everybody has their whole score on their iPad. I don't do that. I still like having a score. My scores have tons of notes written in them. I write lots of notes in all the margins. I keep a file. I keep a notebook on every show. Everything I think about it, everything that I've thought about, everything that's researched. I print out a lot of things. I put it all in a great big notebook. And I have tons of notebooks from years of all different productions. And especially sometimes you go back and do the show again. So you want to find your stuff. Oh, what did I think about this 10 years ago? And so I think that's all part of it. I see Yoko is back. So I know that we're drawing to a close. And I want to put in a plug and invite everybody to come to the East Coast this summer and come to visit us, please, in Glimmerglass. We have a great season of Magic Flute, Trovatore, La Paracole, Wagner concerts, plus several other new works. So please go to our website, glimmerglass.org, and come check us out.